All right, ready to dive deep into some philosophy.
Let's do it.
We're going way back 14th century talking about a guy named Richard Kilvington.
Oh, yeah, Kilvington. Not exactly a household name, right?
Nope, not quite. But this guy's ideas, seriously groundbreaking. We're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as our guide here.
Excellent source.
So get ready to unpack some seriously complex concepts. From logic and physics to ethics and even the nature of God, this guy covered it all.
What's fascinating about Kilvington, to me at least, is he had this really unique approach, using logic and math in ways that were way ahead of his time. Like, imagine applying mathematical principles to ethics.
That's some serious outside-the-box thinking.
Mm.
But before we get too deep into his ideas, let's start with the basics. Who was this Richard Kilvington guy?
Well, the details of his life are a little, murky. Not unusual for someone from that era. We do know he was born around 1302.
Okay, so early 1300s.
Yep. And he studied at Oxford, pretty prestigious, even earned a doctor of theology.
So we're talking serious scholar here.
Definitely. And not just, some ivory tower academic. He actually worked for the king for a while.
Wow, okay, so we've got a scholar connected to power. Sounds like he was a pretty influential figure.
He was. And there's evidence he wasn't afraid to ruffle some feathers. He was known for his criticism of the Mendicant Friars, a very powerful group at the time.
Oh, so a bit of a rebel.
You could say that. So, yeah, not just a bookish intellectual, but someone who was actively engaged in the debates and controversies of his day.
I like him already. But, okay, so we've got a scholar, a bit of a rebel, but what really set Kilvington apart, like intellectually? What made his approach so unique?
Kilvington was, well, obsessed might be the right word, with logic and math. And he applied those tools to, well, practically every area of philosophy. Imagine using mathematical principles to analyze ethics, or logic to try to understand infinity. That's the kind of headspace Kilvington was in.
Wow. Okay, so thinking outside the box doesn't even begin to describe this guy. But I'm trying to picture it. Did he, walk around with a measuring stick trying to quantify every philosophical concept?
Huh. Not quite.
Yeah.
But he definitely had this fascination with measurement and limits. The idea that even abstract concepts could be analyzed in terms of their potential to increase or decrease their boundaries.
Okay. I think I'm starting to get a sense of how his mind worked.
Yeah.
Can you give us, a concrete example? How did he apply this to a real philosophical problem?
Absolutely. Let's take the concept of change. Kilvington argued that there is no first instant of change, only a last instant before the change begins.
Wait, what? No actual moment of transition?
Nope. Think about an apple turning from green to red.
Okay.
Kilvington would say there's a final moment when it's fully green, and immediately after, the process of reddening has already begun. There's no single point where it's in between.
Okay. That's kind of mind-blowing.
It is. It's almost like, remember Zeno's paradox? With the arrow never actually reaching the target?
Oh, yeah.
Same idea. It has to keep covering half the distance, so it never actually gets there.
Wow. Okay. I think I'm following. So this actually leads us to another one of Kilvington's key ideas, right?
It does.
Infinity? Yes, infinity. The concept that always seems to tie my brain in knots. What did Kilvington have to say about that?
Oh, he was completely absorbed by it. But he didn't see infinity just in terms of vastness. He was more interested in the idea of its density. He even came up with a way to, get this, compare different infinities.
Hold on. You can compare infinities. I thought they were all just, infinite. How can one be denser than another?
That's what's so radical about Kilvington's thinking. Picture this. Two infinite lines. One representing all numbers.
Okay.
And the other representing only even numbers.
Okay, got it. Both infinite.
Right. But Kilvington would argue that the line with all numbers is denser because it contains twice as many points within any given interval.
Sure. Even though they're both infinite. One is, packed more tightly.
Exactly.
Wow. That is mind-blowing. So he's not just saying that infinity is big. He's saying there are different levels of infinity, like a hierarchy.
Precisely. And what's amazing is that this idea, different levels of infinity, is actually used in modern mathematics today. Kilvington was centuries ahead of his time.
Incredible. Okay, so he clearly had a knack for applying math to all sorts of unexpected areas. But he didn't just stick to abstract concepts like change and infinity, right? He also applied this to logic, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely. Logic was one of his main areas of expertise. He wrote a whole book called Sophismata, which is basically a collection of like super intricate thought experiments.
Thought experiments, huh? Like philosophical brain teasers.
Exactly. So in one of his most famous ones, he imagines this scenario where Socrates suddenly turns white. Obviously, that's physically impossible,
Right.
but Kilvington wasn't concerned with whether it could happen in reality. He was using it to test the limits of logic. It's like asking what happens to our logical systems when we apply them to impossible situations.
So he was really pushing the boundaries of logic, using these thought experiments to see where the cracks might appear. Almost like he was playing a game with it, trying to like outsmart it.
Exactly. And it wasn't just a game. His work in Sophismata actually had a huge impact on the development of logic. Other philosophers built on his ideas, expanding the field in new and exciting ways.
Wow. This is incredible. Clearly a trailblazer in so many ways. But did he ever go head to head with any of the big names in philosophy? Like, did he ever challenge the ideas of, say, Aristotle?
Oh, absolutely. Especially when it came to physics. Kilvington wasn't afraid to take on Aristotle, even questioning some of his most fundamental laws of motion. He felt that Aristotle's observations didn't always match up with reality.
Okay, now that's bold. I'm dying to know what were Kilvington's criticisms. What did he think Aristotle got wrong?
One of the things Kilvington challenged was Aristotle's idea that any force, no matter how small, could initiate motion.
Oh, interesting. So, like, even the tiniest little push could get something moving.
Yeah, that was Aristotle's view. But Kilvington said, no, 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 there's got to be a minimum force needed to overcome resistance. He even had a term for it. Minimum quadnon.
Minimum quadnon. I like it.
Right. It's kind of like, if you're trying to move something heavy, a tiny nudge won't do anything. You need a certain amount of force to actually get it going.
Right, right. Makes sense. So like a threshold that needs to be crossed.
Exactly. And Kilvington went further. He actually used math to back this up, show that there's a real quantifiable relationship between force, resistance, and motion. He even developed his own laws of motion, building on that whole mathematical foundation.
Wow, so really taking it to the next level. It's amazing how he saw these connections between math and physics that Aristotle seemed to miss. But what I find even more fascinating is how Kilvington applied this quantitative approach to ethics. I mean, how do you even begin to measure something like virtue?
Yeah, it does seem a little counterintuitive, doesn't it? But Kilvington had this very interesting idea. He thought that virtues and vices, they're like physical qualities with varying degrees of intensity.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Go on.
Yeah, so he believed that just like a muscle, virtues could be strengthened or weakened over time. Someone who, let's say, consistently performs generous acts, they're actually increasing the intensity of generosity within themselves.
Oh, I see. So like a moral workout routine. The more you use those virtue muscles, the stronger they get.
Exactly. And on the flip side, if you keep giving in to, say, selfishness, well, that vice becomes more ingrained. It's a really interesting way of thinking about personal responsibility. Kilvington wouldn't have wanted us to just, passively accept our flaws. He'd want us to actively work on becoming better. Moral development is a dynamic process.
Yeah, I love that. That's a powerful message. Still resonates today. But it does bring up a really interesting question. How did Kilvington square this whole idea of character development with the concept of free will? I mean, if our actions shape who we are, does that mean we're not really free to choose?
Yes. The age-old debate. Free will versus determinism. Kilvington didn't shy away from it. In fact, he had a very nuanced view on how human freedom and divine influence interact.
Okay, this should be good. Lay it on me.
Yeah.
How did he reconcile those two seemingly contradictory ideas, an all-powerful God and human beings having genuine freedom of choice?
Well, he started by making a crucial distinction. God's absolute power versus God's ordained power.
Right, right. We talked about that earlier. Absolute power being what God could do, and ordained power being what God actually chooses to do within the universe.
Exactly. So Kilvington argued that God's absolute power, that's infinite. God could theoretically do anything that's logically possible. But the ordained power, that's the power that God chooses to exercise within creation.
So like God setting up the rules of the game, but then letting us play freely within those boundaries.
That's a great way to put it. And Kilvington believed that part of God's ordained power is giving humans genuine free will. We have the capacity to make real choices, even though those choices happen within the context of this divinely created universe.
Okay, I'm following so far. But what about the whole issue of divine foreknowledge? If God already knows everything that's going to happen, doesn't that undermine our freedom? It's like, how can our choices really matter if God's already seen the movie, knows how it ends?
That's the million-dollar question, right? This is where Kilvington's ideas about future contingents get really interesting. Remember, he said that events are contingent because God knows them to be so. It's not the other way around.
Wait, so God's knowledge isn't just passive observation, it's actually like an active force that shapes the possibilities of what might happen.
Precisely. Kilvington believed that our choices are truly free, but God's knowledge of those choices exists simultaneously with our freedom.
Okay, so it's not that God's foreknowledge determines our choices. It's more like our choices and God's knowledge of them are both happening in this eternal present.
Exactly. It's a complex idea, but it's Kilvington's way of trying to reconcile those seemingly opposite concepts, free will and divine omniscience. He saw God's knowledge as like woven into the fabric of reality, not something imposed from the outside.
Whoa, that is heavy stuff. But it makes sense in a way. If God is truly outside of time, then past, present, and future, it's all kind of happening at once from God's perspective. It's just our limited human understanding that makes it seem linear.
Right. Kilvington was really challenging us to stretch our minds when it comes to time and causality.
Absolutely. Now, we can't talk about a 14th century philosopher, especially one who went deep on free will, without talking about predestination. What was Killington's take on that?
Well, he was very careful to distinguish between predestination and reprobation. He believed that God does predestine some for salvation, but that doesn't mean God actively chooses to condemn others.
So he's rejecting that whole idea of double predestination, where God's already decided who's saved and who's damned, no matter what they do.
Exactly. Killington believed God offers salvation to everyone. It's up to each individual to freely choose whether or not to accept it.
But wouldn't that contradict God's omniscience? If God already knows who will choose salvation and who won't, isn't the outcome already set?
Killington would say, no, God's knowledge doesn't force our hand. He believed that God knows what each person will choose, but that doesn't take away the realness of their choice.
Mm-hmm. So it's like knowing that someone will choose chocolate cake doesn't mean you made them choose it.
Perfect analogy. They still have the freedom to choose vanilla if they wanted to.
Right, right. Okay, I see what you're saying. So God's predestination, according to Kilvington, it's based on God's knowledge of our free choices, not some predetermined decree that overrides them.
Exactly. And this really fits with his emphasis on human free will. He saw it as a gift from God. And he believed God wants us to use that gift responsibly, to make choices that lead us towards goodness and ultimately towards salvation.
It's a really hopeful message, even when talking about some pretty, heavy theological topics.
It is. It reminds us that we actually have a role to play in our own spiritual destinies.
It brings us back to that idea of personal responsibility we were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Killington's theology isn't about just passively accepting whatever's going to happen. It's about actively choosing to follow the path toward God, knowing that we have the freedom to make that choice.
It's about embracing our agency, aligning ourselves with the good.
That's beautifully put, and it really highlights Kilvington's belief in the power of human beings to make real, meaningful choices. Even when discussing huge concepts like predestination, he never lost sight of that human element.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that philosophy, even when it's dealing with these really complex theological debates, it can still be deeply relevant to our lives. It can help us make sense of our place in the universe and ultimately empower us to live more thoughtfully and intentionally.
So well said. And as we move into the final part of our exploration, it's important to remember that Kilvington wasn't developing these ideas in isolation. He was part of a vibrant, intellectual community, engaging with other brilliant minds who are wrestling with the same questions.
Right. Those interactions shaped his thinking for sure. So let's talk about Kilvington's intellectual context. Who were the major influences that helped to shape his perspective? Let's delve deeper into his relationship with Duns Scotus and William of Ockham.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Richard Kilvington. We've covered so much ground. Logic, physics, ethics, theology. It's been a wild ride.
Yeah, really fascinating stuff. As we wrap things up here, I think it's worth considering his broader impact. We talked about how he drew from guys like Duns Scotus and William of Ockham, right? But did Kilvington's work influence anyone else? Did he spark anything?
Yeah, did his ideas light any philosophical fires, leave a mark on the landscape?
Oh, absolutely. Especially his Sophismata and his writings on physics. They had a huge impact on the next generation of what they call the Oxford calculators. Thinkers like William Hadebury, John Dumbleton, Roger Swineshead. They took his ideas and ran with them, really pushed that whole mathematical approach to philosophy even further.
Wow, so he was kind of like the intellectual godfather to these other thinkers.
You could say that Kilvington's willingness to, challenge the big names like Aristotle, his emphasis on being super precise with logic, and his innovative use of math, it all paved the way for a whole new era of philosophical inquiry. A real pioneer.
It's amazing how his ideas rippled outward, not just impacting his immediate circle, but shaping the whole conversation for centuries.
Yeah, speaks to the power of ideas, right? Even now, centuries later, Kilvington's work is still making us think, challenging us to, question our own assumptions and explore new ways of looking at those big philosophical questions.
Which brings me to my last question. Why should we, here in the 21st century, care about a 14th century philosopher wrestling with stuff that seems pretty far removed from our daily lives? What makes Killington relevant to us today?
It's a great question. I think the answer is this. The questions Kilvington grappled with, logic, knowledge, ethics, free will, the nature of God, these are timeless. They're not limited to any one historical period.
Right. It's not just about dusty old philosophical puzzles. These are fundamental questions about what it means to be human.
Exactly. And we're still grappling with a lot of the same stuff that Killington was working on centuries ago. What's cool is how he approached those questions, with this rigorous logic, questioning everything, searching for clarity. It's a great model for how we can engage with those big ideas.
He reminds us that we shouldn't be afraid of tough questions. Use every tool we've got, logic, reason, imagination, even math, to make sense of the world.
And even if we don't find all the answers, just wrestling with these questions, it can lead us to a deeper understanding of ourselves and the universe.
I love that. So it's not just about the specific conclusions Kilvington reached. It's about that spirit of inquiry.
Exactly. His legacy isn't just in what he figured out, but in how he went about it.
Beautifully put. Well, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the world of Richard Kilvington. Hopefully you've enjoyed the journey as much as we have.
It's been a pleasure exploring these complex ideas with you, and I hope it's made you curious to learn more about philosophy in general.
There's a whole universe of ideas out there. Keep those philosophical gears turning.
Absolutely. Until next time, keep questioning, keep searching, and never stop wondering.